I'm particularly excited because today we're talking about, or next 4 weeks, we're going to be talking about cotton, cattle, and railroads, which is a subject that no one really seems to know how to connect very well. It's this era of where like lots of things seem to be happening all on top of each other. And I had a friend in grad school who just called it the era of everything happening at once. This is the post Civil War, post Reconstruction, really, but like late 19th century, just things happen everywhere. So we wanted to do this because we wanted to give a little clarity to the era and give you guys connections between things. I think there's a theme for the course of the 4 weeks we're going to be covering all this is that everything is connected during this era, that the road to cattle and the road to railroads and the road to everything that happens with cotton are intertwined with each other. And that's going to make it hopefully more useful to introduce to your students and connect to things across topics and people over a sort of large period of time to help make it make more sense. All right. So that's really our goal for this series is to help make this make sense, make things connect over big courses of time, and this is where Chassidy and Jay are the superstars to give you guys stuff that you can take directly into your classroom and just start using right away. All right, so I'm the historian. I'm going to give you guys the overviews of content and materials. Jay and Chassidy, my teammates on this, are going to give you guys the stuff to take into the classroom itself. All right. If you haven't been to one of these before, the way we organize this is pretty straightforward because we're doing this over Zoom and you don't want to hear me talk for 45 minutes straight. We kind of break it up into two halves. We do a first half and a second half. And I'm going to give a little historical overview with a PowerPoint. And then Chassidy's going to come in and give you guys some materials and talk through how to use some of this stuff in the classroom. Then I'm going to give you guys some more historical material. And then Jay's going to come in and give you guys some stuff to use as well. And so the idea is to give you guys stuff to take into your classrooms itself. And at the end, along the way, we'll have a question and answer and kind of a discussion depending on how much time we have. Okay. All right. Two recommendations for you as before we jump into all this. Recommendation one, use the chat. Please use the chat. You guys are your best resource. All right. We have a ton of teachers, all right, from all over the state. And actually, some of you looks like are not actually even in the States. So we've got people from all over. And so you guys have ideas, feedback, questions, thoughts, sometimes perspectives, whatever it is, throw it into the chat. All right. It's been one of the most useful things in these webinar series over time that I highly recommend. All right. So please do that. And then the other thing is that we put together a little web form for you guys that see if Jay can share that with us and drop a link into the chat. It's in the Google Classroom, but we decided to frame something to help you guys think about how you guys can use this in the classroom and the challenges and opportunities that will come with that. Has anyone heard of the acronym SWOT, which is often used in business? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You ever heard of that? It's used in business discussions and such about how we can get better positioned to succeed in the workforce. We're not going to quite use that, but we've adapted it a little bit toward education. So we have a little web form that Jay's put together that has strengths, like what are the most impactful aspects of this lesson that you can use, weaknesses, what are challenges, opportunities, like how can we use this in useful ways, activities, what are some activities that you could use from this in the classroom and how that would work, and then teaching considerations, as we call it. What factors would create perhaps constraints on using this? What are challenges and that sort of stuff? And the whole idea is to help you frame as you're walking along, as we're going through this stuff, how can I use this? What will be problems or challenges? And sort of give you a little blueprint for how you might take some of this material into the classroom. All right. Does that make sense? Feel good? Okay. And at the end, I'm going to ask questions about you guys, what you guys wrote down. So there will be homework that we're going to ask you, or a test at the end of all this stuff. All right, so let me share my screen and we're going to dive in because I want to maximize use of our time. All right, so you guys can see this? Give me a thumbs up here. All right, fantastic. All right, so we're going to dive into this week. We're talking about the fall of American Indians in Texas. And the reason is because this sets up so much of what happens with cattle, so much what happens with railroads, and so much what happens with cotton. All right, so this is kind of the background that you have to know and understand to get into it. And when we start, we talk about Native Americans or American Indians. The first question I always get, so I just want to start at the very beginning, is what words can I use in the classroom that are safe and not going to get me in trouble? Um, there's a lot of questions that my students have about terminology with Native Americans, and for very good reason. I'll just tell you, I wanted to point you guys real fast to this resource, the Smithsonian's Museum of the American Indian, which has an amazing amount of resources about Native Americans, but it has a great part of it where they talk about terminology, about do I use American Indian? Do I use Native American? Can I use the word Indian, indigenous? What's the most appropriate thing to use? And the answer is all of those are appropriate in various contexts. The best thing to do is to be as specific as possible and use tribal names, um, like Comanche or Apache or Kiowa. The Native American has been widely used for a long time, but a lot of indigenous groups actually in North America prefer American Indian. And so both terms are very appropriate. So what I always tell people is just talk about it. Talk about it with your students. It's good to get in front of that sort of thing at the beginning. I always do with my classes whenever the opportunity arises. So I want to do that with you guys and say I'm going to be using Native American, American Indian, and Indian pretty much interchangeably as we dive through these things. All right, but I just wanted to flag everybody to that at the very beginning. All right, so let's dive in. We're talking about Native Americans in Texas and basically the fall of them by the mid 1870s that really opens up the Texas plains. All right, and the central question that I want to start with this is something I always ask my students, which is to think about what were the changes in Texas that made American Indians much more vulnerable by 1870? Because as you guys know from teaching Texas history, Comanches and other groups were the ones in charge during the Spanish period, right? They had been the ones who've been some of the most powerful groups in Texas. But by the time you get to the 1870s, that has shifted dramatically, and the American Indians in Texas are defeated by the U.S. Army and then sent basically out of Texas. So how does that happen, right? How does that great big shift occur? And so this is where we get to connect what we're talking about in the 1870s to all those units that you guys have been talking about previous to that, right? Going all the way back to Native peoples. But American Indians have been in Texas, for tens of thousands of years, and had been the largest, most powerful groups in Texas up until really the 1830s or so. In fact, that was the reason that the Spanish originally, and then Mexico, approves the idea of bringing in Anglo-Americans to come colonize in Texas when Moses Austin gets his grant in 1820. And then Stephen F. Austin takes over when his father dies in 1821, right? A large reason for that, of course, is that groups like the Comanche, so that's the image right here on your right, have been controlling most of Texas through most of this period. And so the Spanish and then later Mexico will want Americans to come in part because they're hoping that that will help push out native powers within the region. And that's really a lot of what happens in the 1820s and the 1830s, isn't it? Stephen F. Austin starts coming in 1821. His colony along the Brazos and the Colorado rivers, which I know you guys talked all about with your classes in the spring, or sorry, in the fall. He brings in thousands and thousands of Americans. He also brings in enslaved African Americans, and that's a whole nother story. But that influx of people pushes out all of these Native American groups that had lived in this region. So the Tonkawas that used to live at the northern portion of what would be Austin's colony get pushed out to the north. And the Karankawas to the south, right? They don't just get pushed out, they get run out by Stephen F. Austin, who he puts together a militia that actually violently and by force pushes out Native Americans from the coastal region down there. And that's a process that's been going on in Texas starting in the 1820s into the 1830s, and it will continue under the Republic of Texas in a big and powerful way. During the 1836 to 1845 period, when Texas is its own nation, there's a massive influx of people from the United States. It's about roughly about 100,000 people come pouring into Texas from 1836 to 1845. That's a lot of people. And it displaces a lot of the native groups that had been living in places, especially in East Texas. So a theme that you guys will pick up on here is that one of the great big shifts that goes on throughout this entire period, starting with Austin's colony and then moving forward from there, is that just this influx of Americans into Texas, increasingly, especially East Texas, pushes out all of these native groups. And then that gets accelerated by Mirabeau Lamar, which you guys know. I'm sure you guys, when you teach the Republic of Texas, we usually teach this as Houston's presidency, Lamar, second president, back to Houston, some guy named Anson Jones for 5 hot minutes at the very end. But you guys know, Lamar declares war on the Indians in Texas, right? And he builds up the Texas Army, he marches it into East Texas, and they run out pretty much all the tribes in East Texas. Was the Caddo groups, the Delawares, the Shawnees, who were refugees from the United States that had come over. He pushes all of them out and pushes them further west. And then he attacks the Comanches, and that kind of gets fought to a stalemate, more or less. But it means that by the time you get to Texas joining the United States in 1845, right, that Indians in East Texas and along the Gulf Coastal Plain have been pushed out and pushed west in a big and powerful way. And so this is a really useful map. I love maps. So most of my PowerPoints, I end up using a lot of maps. But I love this map here because what it is it's a line of the Texas forts that had been built by the early 1850s. So right after Texas is annexed and the U.S.-Mexico War is over in 1848, you can see there's this line of forts that gets established a little west of Dallas and Waco and Austin, and down all the way to Eagle Pass, right? And it's right along the edge of the plains, essentially. And to the right of that, to the east of that, is where almost all Anglo-Americans and African-Americans in Texas live. So that's all the farming districts. That's all the East Texas area. And that's where most of the population that's been moving into Texas has been going. By 1850, there's about 200,000 in Texas, non-Indians. Most of the Indians in Texas have been pushed further west. They're out in the plains, right? So it's Comanche and Apache, and then a few other groups like Kiowas, and then some hybrid groups like Kiowa Apache that have moved in. So it's almost all plains Indians. Which you guys know, like when you guys talk about native peoples in Texas from the very earliest days, there's a lot of different tribes in a lot of different parts of Texas from the very beginning, and they're all adapted to their particular geographies. That's changed by the 1850s. The survivors are the ones out on the plains, and they're the last kind of holdout for all that area right there, right? And then what happens in the 1850s? Americans come pouring in even bigger numbers, right? 400,000 more people show up in 10 years, from 1850 to 1860, 400,000 more people. Where do they go? Well, they go to East Texas, and they get closer and closer and closer out to the plains, which puts even more pressure on the Indians out there on the frontier. And so there's more conflict by the time you get to the American Civil War between Anglo settlers and the Native American groups out on the frontier or on the plains region out there. And you can actually see this in the secession votes. All right. So if you've gotten to the Civil War in Texas and you talk about secession, I don't know if you guys show your students these numbers, but Texas votes overwhelmingly to secede from the United States in 1861. Right? Why? Slavery. That's a whole nother discussion. Not for this one right now, but that's the reason. But there is, a third or a quarter of the vote that goes against secession. And what's really interesting about it is where it is. So you guys see here in North Texas right here, this is the areas that voted against secession. And then West Texas out here in the Texas Hill Country, these are the two big areas that voted against secession. Historians have long argued, why were they against secession? There's a couple reasons, but one of the main ones is that these are the areas that feel the most vulnerable to Native American attacks because they're right on the frontier line. They're right on the Plains region line. And in North Texas, which is where I'm at right now, I'm in Denton, It's right near the reservations that have been set up in what's called at the time Indian Territory, modern day Oklahoma. And so these are the areas that are nervous in part about losing the protection of the US Army against Native American attacks. And then, of course, in the hill country here, you have the German presence as well, which is another factor. But this concern about the frontier at the time of the Civil War is something that's on the minds of Texans because of the Native Americans in the region. And there's a fear that if there's a war, there's going to be attacks. But the reality is, during the Civil War, the Native Americans don't attack in any or raid Anglo settlements in any much larger numbers, not really significant. It's not till after the Civil War when those attacks go up pretty dramatically, right? So when the Confederacy is defeated in 1865, which, by the way, the last battle of the Civil War happens in Texas. But when the Confederacy collapses, the U.S. Army doesn't just run back into Texas and take over those forts again. All right. So there's a period where there's just kind of nobody there in those frontier forts. And the Kiowa and the Comanche in particular take this opportunity to raid in the late 1860s. And so this is James Throckmorton, who becomes governor during the post-Civil War period right here. And he writes a report about what he called Indian depredations, but there were Indian raiders who killed, you can see, 162 Texans, captured 43, and wounded another 24 during the 2 years between 1865 and 1867. There's a surge as these Plains Indians are pushing back on the frontier movement of Anglo-Americans coming in. Does that make sense? There's this movement in, and they're pushing back, and they see an opportunity right after the Civil War to push back real hard, right? Does that help them? No, because what ends up happening is that the U.S. Army takes notice of this and decides, oh, we really do need to send soldiers down to Texas pretty fast and furious. So by 1867, 68, the U.S. Army is sending down more troops. They're sending down people to start building more forts. And so what you see right here on the map is that the line of forts after the Civil War gets extended west into the plains, into far west Texas, into the Texas Panhandle. And you can see there's not a line right along the plains. Now it's everywhere out west, right? So what does that mean? That means the U.S. Army is now getting into the places where these Native American groups live. And then the U.S. Army is getting into conflicts. And when the U.S. Army goes out here, so do American settlers who think that it's going to be safer to go out to this region, which puts them into conflict again with these Native American tribes. And this gets us to the big pressures that Indian groups in Texas feel after the Civil War. And there's two major pressures. So if you're writing notes, write down two main pressure points. All right. We're going to talk through each one of them. All right. Major pressure point number one, population surge into Texas. Americans just pour into Texas after the American Civil War for lots of reasons, which we don't have time to get into. But there's cheap land, there's opportunity in Texas. So a lot of Americans abandon Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Virginia, and all over the place, and they come to Texas. So I'm going to give you guys a couple numbers to illustrate this. So in 1870, the population, we do our census, is 800,000 people in Texas. All right. That's impressive. That's gone up since the Civil War. But look at what happens in 10 years. By 1880, it has doubled, doubled to 1.6 million. It's a massive increase, right? And then by 1890, it's almost doubled again. So you go from 800,000 to 2.2 million in 20 years, all right? People come pouring into the state. Where are they going? Well, some of them are going to East Texas, but a lot of them are moving further and further west into the central Texas areas, onto the edge of the plains, or in some cases out into the plains themselves, right? Where does that put them in the backyard of? The Comanches, the Apaches, the Kiowas, the last holdouts of Indians in Texas. It puts increased pressure on those Indians in Texas, and they're feeling surrounded, right? So for these groups, you got to understand, like, the job of a historian in many ways is to think empathetically, like look at things from the other people's perspectives. And so I always ask my students, look at this from the perspective of a Comanche. What would that have looked like, felt like, right? As you feel these people coming in from all directions. That's pressure point number one. Pressure point number two, all right, is what happens to the buffalo or bison. Buffalo and bison are just two words for the exact same thing, right? And this is where railroads come in. See, everything's connected. Everything's going to be connected all 4 weeks. So railroad expansion had been going on before the Civil War. You guys know that, right? And it's during the Civil War that there's the Republican Party passes legislation to connect the railroad, not just all over the Northeast, but all the way to California. All right. And so that gets going in the late 1860s. And so they're building across the plains. And you guys can see like there's one long, lone railroad line heading out towards San Francisco right here. And it's going across that Great Plains region. When it gets to the plains, what does it find? Well, what did the railroad guys find? Well, they all find this massive open grassland region, yes, but there are millions and millions of buffalo out on the plains, right? And I think it's hard to conceive of just how numerous the bison were out on the American plains at this time. If you've ever seen Dances with Wolves, I think it does a lot of things that we could talk about, but one of the things it does really well is it gives you a sense of just the scale of the number of bison that are out there, who are the mainstay of the Plains Indians in all ways. Food, shelter, clothing, and everything they, in between comes from these bison. Well, when they're building the railroads going through there, I mean, they see these bison, they're everywhere, and you can see this lithograph. You know, you could just shoot them from the locomotive, from the train, for sport, for entertainment. It's like slapping flies. There's a bazillion of them. Really, what's the big deal here, right? Nobody did much with these besides the Plains Indians for a long time, in part because they were kind of curiosities, but you can't haul the meat back, and their leather, people had bought some of buffalo hides before, but there was no good way to tan the leather yet, and so it wasn't really usable in the markets until the 1870s. And in 1872, there's this moment where they figure out a tanning process that will work well for the bison. And so I love using this illustration. I use this for my students because it's very stark. But in 1872, there's a Philadelphia tanner who bought 57 buffalo hides for $200, figured out it made great leather, put in an order for 2,000 more. And when he did that, he started a new market. He said, like, I'll pay top dollar for 2,000 hides. And then soon after that, his competitors put in standing orders, not just for 2,000 hides, for as many hides as hunters could bring to them in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Just unlimited money, basically. Bring in a hide, you get a couple bucks for every hide, and as many hides as you can bring in. It's glorious. So people hit the plains. Hunters go out to the plains in huge numbers. And this is again where timing in history always really matters, right? They have high-powered rifles now. Why do they have high-powered rifles? Well, a lot of it's because of the American Civil War, which our ability to kill 725,000 of ourselves during the Civil War had also developed our ability to develop great firearms. And so high-powered weaponry was readily available. And so you have these hunters who go out to the plains because, like, see those bison in the background there? Every one of those guys is worth a couple bucks, and they're free. They're just out there. You just go collect them. It's like gold nuggets running around. You just throw as many as you can in your basket. And so hunters would go out. They would kill as many bison as they could possibly kill. The way it would work is you had usually one hunter, so that's this guy right here, and he would hire 5 or 6 guys to work for him. And those guys' jobs was not to kill buffalo. Those guys' job was to skin the buffalo that this guy killed. Because he'd get up on a bluff somewhere, and, you know, this is the open plains. You get up on a bluff, you have a huge herd of bison, there's thousands of them, tens of thousands in some cases, and you just pick them off. Just boom, 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 boom. You kill as many as you think your skinners can handle, and then you send them in, and then they just do their work skinning the bison. They're only interested in the hides because you can't move the meat anywhere. There's no market for anything besides the hides that they can have any part of. So they kill as many of those guys as they can. This guy's fascinating. If you've never heard of Billy Dixon, he's a Texan. He was a very successful buffalo hunter, and he wrote a memoir later that we have some great stuff from. And this is him talking about the killing the buffalo. You can read the quote with me, but no mercy was shown the buffalo. I killed as many as my 3 men, his skinners, could handle, working them as hard as they were willing to work. This was deadly business, without sentiment. It was dollars against tender-heartedness, and dollars won. Which, unfortunately, in my experience, dollars usually win in that face-off. But huge numbers of bison were killed, absolutely massive numbers. So you can see right here, this is a camp that the buffalo hunters would bring in the hides, stack them up, waiting for the next train to come through, that would, or wagons usually, that would take them to the nearest train that would take them to the east. But every one of those hides is worth a couple dollars. All right, huge amounts of money. This, I think, is the most powerful image that I use to explain this to my students. That is a mountain of nothing but buffalo skulls. Those are all skulls, just to give you a sense of the scale at which this is happening, right? And this all happens very fast in the 1870s. There's about 3.5 million bison/buffalo who were slaughtered between the mid-1870s and the mid-1880s, right? That's an amazing story all by itself. But to our story that we're talking about, the demise of the American Indians in Texas and in the plains in general, this is a crisis, right, of the first order. Because if you're a Comanche or an Apache or a Sioux up in the Dakotas, this is what you live on, all right? And Texans understood this. The U.S. Army understood this, all right? So this is a quote from General Philip Sheridan, who was a U.S. Union general during the Civil War. He's a prominent U.S. general after the Civil War, and he says, you can see, buffalo hunters have, quote, done more in the last 2 years to solve what he called the vexed Indian question than the entire regular army has done in the last 30 years. Because what you have is pressure now coming from two sides, right? You have this massive influx of population of millions of Americans coming in and then moving their way out towards the plains. At the same time, behind the Indians, the buffalo are being killed off, the thing that they depend on more than anything else. And it's like two sides of a vice coming in and squeezing them, and all the pressure coming around them on both sides. The question is, how do they react to it? How do they resolve that? And that's what we'll talk about in the second section. So I'm going to pause there and then hand the mic to my colleague and friend, Chassidy, who is going to walk you guys through a couple of resources.
Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Great. Thank you. I can hear Andrew do that a dozen times over. It's always so fascinating. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and jump into some resources that we've put together for you all to take some of the materials that were presented in the presentation and then some other primary sources and allow you to insert them into your instruction. And so in the Google Classroom, you'll see in the resources, there's all these lessons. So this is day 1, lesson 1, and it focuses on the content that you all just heard, which is sort of that intersection between the mass wave of settlers in Texas, the railroad, and the destruction of the bison or the buffalo. Andrew touched upon this early on. As a Texas history teacher myself, this is the point in the curriculum where getting kids to understand that eras overlap is the most important, because it's like Andrew said, this is the time period when all things happen at one period of time. And so one of the things that I always found most helpful is really clarifying that point with the kiddos. And so there's this really simple graphic organizer, I encourage you to add on to it. So as you get from today is Indian Wars, and then we'll talk about cattle and cotton, we can start adding layers. A quick activity, just sort of as a warm up or a hook, is to really get the kids to thinking about what time, what date range these things occur, and then they can start to see from there that there's some overlap. And then what are some the defining characteristics? And then there's overlap, and then some of the major events. And then really getting them to talk about how do eras overlap. Um, and based on this, the historical events that are taking place, how are different people impacted by certain things over time, right? So from westward expansion to the Indian Wars, for example, was the example that I gave here. This is a simple graphic organizer. Like I said, you can change out the titles, you can add more layers onto it. One of the ways that I paired this in the classroom with a visual discovery activity, and as we would get into the eras, I would create like a photo collage. And then it got to the point where I had kids create the photo collage out of some of the primary sources or the images. And then we would guess what era is being displayed, right? And so this one just kind of takes some of the photos from the first part of the lesson and puts it in there. And so then students would be able to guess the era, guess the date range based on what they see. And then you can build upon these. It's essentially a quick little illustration and to get kids to visualize what is taking place at the time period in comparison to the time period prior or the time period after. And like I said, you can totally get them involved as well. So that was just a little hook activity. I saw people taking pictures of the slides that Dr. Torget was using. So this is a way to just kind of bring it all together. Um, I am a primary source and portal of Texas history junkie. I get caught in that rabbit hole for hours just looking at documents. And so in prepping for this, there were so many maps that told the story on its own. And so one of the activities that I chose to put together for you all is mapping the Indian raids by county. Yes, you could tell the students like, yes, most of the skirmishes with the natives occurred on the frontier line, or you could actually have them figure it out on their own. And so that's really the fun part for me. So there's this activity in there which is interaction between settlers and natives. I always like to start with a background paragraph, so you can either read that to the students or have them read it prior to, just to sort of build their background and give them some context. One of the key features of this is this quote from a letter from uh, Governor Throckmorton to President Johnson, saying that our frontiers are rapidly depopulating from Indian depredation. So you might have to define depredation. And I am requested by the legislature, unless immediate assistance is afforded by the government, to call out 1,000 men for its defense. And so this is part of a very large report, and I did link it in the document below, where it's a collection of pleas and letters and reports and charts from the state of Texas to the US government, essentially trying to make an argument about why we need to be moving federal troops onto the frontier and reestablishing forts and things of that nature. And so, um, one of the things that I pulled out of the research is this chart. And I linked it to the full document. It's a Library of Congress research. I also believe it's in the portal. I put the link to the original document in case you want to blow it up and pull it out. It's on page 30. This is a chart where they are listing out what they call the depredations by Indians through years. And so you have 1873 since 1866, and then you have 1873 to date, which is the date that the report was filed in 1875. And they're listed by county: how many citizens were killed, wounded, carried off, attacked, how many cattle were stolen, how many horses and mules were stolen. And so, and it lists this by county. So I actually created this activity because I was just curious to see how it worked out. And so I also gave you a blank map of counties in Texas. And so I never create an activity unless I do it myself, as you can see. And so once I started going through the county list and shading in, I was like, oh, it does match. Like the reports that they were sending in actually aligns with the boundaries of the frontier. It aligns with the placements of the forts. So you see the same information conveyed in different types of data. And that's what we really want our students to be able to analyze if we are teaching with inquiry in mind. And so that's the first step. That's the prime the pump. They're going to look at the chart. They're going to shade in the map, the counties. They're also going to get very familiar with some counties that they might not know where they exist. And then we can have that conversation about comparing it to some of the other maps. And so Dr. Torget did a great job unpacking this map, but once students have this coded in, then you can sort of say, what correlation can you make to the map you colored in and the map of Texas secession? And then there's some questions that relate to it as well. Then we focus on another map, which is the location of the federal forts during this time period. Again, the goal is to have them use their map that they created and sort of cross analyze it with the historical map and then answer those questions. And then you'll see this coming up in the second part of the program. It's taking the population change maps over time from 1870 to 1900. And again, looking at both that ledger and their document and answering some questions. So great maps. The maps tell a story in and of itself. And I felt that it would be doing you a disservice to not build something with those cool maps that you were all screenshotting because I was watching. Here we go. So the next set of activities, we talk about the bison and the hunting of the buffalo, and there's lots of resources. I mean, any quick search, you can find buffalo hunter stories and buffalo hunter paintings and buffalo hunter poems, and that's great. But one of the things that I like to do is try to bring in the other perspective and the other point of view and what's happening to the natives while this buffalo hunting is taking place. And so I created a primary source activity in PowerPoint, so there's no need to like print a whole bunch of things. You can print it and give it to students as a primary source packet, or you can project it and walk them through one at a time. It's totally up to you. And of course, I had to use the cutest photograph of buffalo and bison to start off with, because yeah, anything else is unacceptable. So this PowerPoint, let me see if I can view slideshow. Perfect. It's going to start off with a visual analysis activity. So this looks like a blank screen, but it's not a blank screen. We're going to do like a 4-corner analysis with this. And so you can do this whole group. You can actually print the primary source image and cut it in quadrants and hand it to different groups of students and have them unpack that piece. And as they put it together, it builds layers. I just use PowerPoint and I hid some tiles. So you'll see, you just probe the students. What do you see? What do you think is taking place? Obviously, we have buffalo running. There's not much else to the image. As we add layers to the photo, then you start to see some other elements. Students be able to make out, yes, there's a train. And if you have really good eyesight, you can see that they're jumping off the train and that some of them are holding things, but you can't quite make out what they're holding. And then you also see the lines in the background. So that might help spark a student understand what time period this is taking place in. We have another element. Now there's more buffalo. There's the tracks. And then finally, we see that this is a train. And then you can clearly see that these gentlemen are shooting at the buffalo from the train. So this is just another strategy to do a vision analysis, but in a different format, different fashion, a little more engaging than just putting the photograph up. I still like magic paper. If you've been to one of those old LRE magic paper, take white paper. I see some heads nodding. It works great for this as well. So this is our launching activity for this. So you want students to think about what's taking place during this time period. Obviously, we have railroads coming in, settlement coming in, and the killing of the bison. And then I'm not going to go through all this for the sake of time, But this primary source set is based off of the perspectives and the opinions of the natives at the time period. And so we have a quote from Santana about the buffalo. And then we also have an excerpt from a prologue of a book called The Way to Rainy Mountain, which is a Kiowa novelist. And he's also talking about the bison and what happened to the Kiowas due to the killing of the buffalo. And then we have The End of the World, The Buffalo Go by Old Lady Horse. This is written by Old Lady Horse, telling her testimony of what happened to her people, again, the Kiowa, based on the killing of the buffalo. And then we have 2 paintings and then a quote, which came from an excerpt from Harper's Weekly magazine, about the natives and how they used and revered the buffalo. And then lastly, we have the same quote that Dr. Torget showed you, which was from U.S. General Philip Sheridan. And then we have the document analysis questions. And so students would be able to answer some questions to be able to understand that although buffalo hunting was extremely profitable for the settlers and was a great means for them as they moved in, that it ultimately destroyed and decimated the native population. And so it focuses specifically on the plight of the natives with an emphasis on the Kiowas and their experience during the buffalo hunt. And last but not least, the buffalo soldiers. This is just a quick little inquiry activity. There's a lot on buffalo soldiers. And so I was like, I'm not going to reinvent any wheels. There's so much on the buffalo soldiers. So what I did was I just kind of created this to put everything in one place for you. I always did this when I taught 7th grade. I started talking about the buffalo soldiers by playing Buffalo Soldiers by Bob Marley. Only the first part though. And then get kids to do a quick KWL chart based on the lyrics of that song. And then we come back and we revisit it. This document has a variety of just sort of strategies for students to use and engage as they use a variety of sources. So I just put a few. So obviously we have the resources for educators, TX4T. There's a Buffalo Soldier lesson with great images. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Service has a wonderful kit of resources based on the Buffalo Soldiers, as well as Library of Congress. And then there's a book about the Buffalo Soldiers. And so I just put links to those. So you can build that out however you choose to build out, whether it's stations or online stations, kind of scatter those resources and have students fill out that information. And then we get them talking about what are the positive and negative aspects. Almost all of the sources that I linked talk a little bit about the plight of the Buffalo Soldier and the time period with discrimination or just the struggle out on the frontier. And so they would be able to answer that. And then lastly is just a little bit of analysis of their motto. So Buffalo Soldiers operate under 2 mottos: we can, we will, and ready and forward. And so once students have learned about the Buffalo Soldiers, they'll get to kind of write their opinion about why they think those mottos were fitting for the Buffalo Soldiers. And that is day 1, lesson 1.
Thank you, Chassidy. I just absolutely love all of that because I'm going to steal about 98% of that from my own classroom. So thank you.
Well, I stole it from you first.
Well, but that's the thing, like that it all connects. That's what I love about this, like the connectivity between like the history and then how it can be used in the classroom and the connections. I just think that's beautiful. I also think the chat's beautiful because people have been suggesting various types of things and bringing in some really cool stuff about other opportunities. Like I think it was Charlotta, if I'm saying the name right, talked about the National Park Service's materials as well, which I think is fabulous. So there's so much stuff. It's just knowing where it is and trying to bring to the surface all the best of it. All right. Well, let's jump back in because Chassidy gave the perfect, she always does, segue to the next section here. So we're back into my PowerPoint. We left with Phil Sheridan saying that buffalo hunters are destroying the Native Americans, and he's in favor of that. And it's very effective. And in fact, just a little fun factoid for you. The Texas state legislature in the 1870s realized that the bison were being killed off in such numbers that they could go extinct. And there was a bill put in front of the legislature to do something to stop that, to try to save the bison. And it failed because the Texas legislators are like, yeah, we don't want the bison to go. But if it kills the Indians, then that's probably for the best. So it was, my point is, people recognized it at the time as an effective, powerful tool to undermine Native Americans, right? But the killing of the bison is not what finishes Native American Indian power in Texas. And so that's the second question that I wanted to frame for our second half here, right? How was it that the U.S. Army was able to defeat American Indians in Texas by 1875? Because that's the end, 1875, not the end of American Indian history in Texas by any means, but of dominant power and influence in the plains, for example. That's a really short jump from the early 1870s when this hunting is happening, right? A lot of it is because the U.S. Army focuses heavily on Texas because of these increasing clashes between Native American groups and the American settlers who are pouring into Texas. And one of the figures you probably wouldn't expect to show up in this is William Tecumseh Sherman here, right? Who, as you guys have probably heard, was a Civil War general under Ulysses S. Grant. He's best known for being careless with fire in Atlanta. But he gets sent to the Texas frontier in the early 1870s precisely because of this increased fighting that's happening between American settlers and these Native American groups. That Chassidy had that great quote from the governor of Texas talking about this to the U.S. government. That's what's bringing William Tecumseh Sherman to Texas. And William Tecumseh Sherman, he doesn't mess around. Right? He is a serious man who is inspecting all of the forts. So he comes out here to Texas and he goes between not all of them, but he goes to a lot of these different forts out here, inspecting the situation and getting a sense of it on the ground for himself. And in May of 1871, right, so this date's going to be important here. In May of 1871, early May of 1871, he is in San Antonio, Texas. Right, so I don't know if we have anybody from San Antonio with us, but he's in San Antonio, early May 1871, and he leaves to go to Fort Richardson. I don't know if you guys can see on the map right here. Fort Richardson's up at the top, kind of near where Fort Worth would be. All right, so he's going from San Antonio up to Fort Richardson along the edge of the plains. All right, who's he going with? A small contingent of Buffalo soldiers that Chassidy was just talking about. 17 African-American soldiers who are his armed escort that are escorting him up there. And I say all that to say, one, it's a great opportunity to bring in Buffalo soldiers into the story with our students. But two, he's got 17 guards. That is not very many people. So he doesn't feel too vulnerable, perhaps, but he should, because as he gets close to Fort Richardson, right, he's approaching Fort Richardson. And as he does, he's right up here in North Texas. This is May 17th, 1871. He's riding up toward Fort Richardson. He's very close, within a day's ride of Fort Richardson. And as he's getting close up on a hill, this is out on the plains, up on a hill, he and the 17 Buffalo soldiers see a group of Kiowa Indians. These Kiowas are being led by a man named Santana that Chassidy had some material from earlier, which is fabulous. His name was White Eagle amongst the Kiowa, and Santana was mostly what he was known to the Anglo-Americans. We can call him either one. I'm going to call him Santana mostly. But he was a Kiowa chief who was fed up and done with the killing of the buffalo and the bison. And he and the Kiowas are feeling enormous pressure, so he wanted to push back. And so he put together a band of about 150 warriors who were planning to basically do something, which is to say attack something. They're looking for a good target. And Tecumseh Sherman rides past them with 17 guards, and Santana decides not to attack for whatever reason. We don't know what. If he had come down with 150 Kiowa, Sherman would have died. that would have been the end of Sherman, and history would have gone some very interesting directions perhaps at that point. But he doesn't attack Sherman. Sherman rides on, gets to Fort Richardson, but the very next day, on May 18th, 1871, and that's a date worth writing down, May 18th, 1871, Santana and his men see a group of wagons moving along the plains, right? And that group of wagons, it was leaving Fort Richardson and it was going out here to Fort Griffin. So you see up here at the top, going from Fort Richardson to Fort Griffin. It's just a couple of wagons. It was 12 Teamsters, right, who are going along. And Santana's men see them and decide, we're going to attack them. So 150 Kiowa come rushing down the hillside in the plains, and they surround the Teamsters, all 12 of them, and attack and kill most of them, destroy the wagons. But what was really horrific about this is that they disembowel these guys and do all kinds of horrible physical violence to them, right? Because the Kiowa here are trying to send a message of what's happening with the forts moving west, with the buffalo hunters moving west, that if you move into our territory, this is the kind of fate that is awaiting you. So they were trying to send a message. Unfortunately, that message was received and played very harshly against the Kiowas and really all the Plains Indians. And I want to emphasize this. Santana here is a Kiowa, and the newspapers and all the accounts of what happened don't distinguish between the Kiowas and the Apaches, or the Kiowas and the Comanches. It's just all Indians as one big group. And so what Santana does gets him in trouble, but it also gets all the other Plains Indians into the crosshairs, really, of the U.S. Army, right? Because this is written up in the newspapers. So Chassidy was mentioning, again, the portal of Texas history. One of my favorite things about that is the newspapers. They're just so much material in there. I pulled this from the portal newspapers. There's 7, I know you guys know this, but I just want to emphasize to you guys. If you haven't been to the portal of Texas history in a while, go in there, search the newspapers. There are 7 million pages of historical newspapers from Texas, free, available. You can find almost a primary source on almost anything very quickly. And this is how what becomes known as the Salt Creek Massacre, because it happens right near something called the Salt Creek. This is how it's covered in the newspaper. An Indian massacre. And then a really weird subheadline, some thrilling experiences in Texas. But it goes into great detail about what happened with the raid there, and it's just very bloody sort of accounting of that. And it talks about how close Sherman came to getting killed. And Sherman himself knew how close he came to getting killed, because this happened the day after he'd crossed over. And then one of the Teamsters, amazing, one of the Teamsters survives this attack and straggles back to Fort Richardson and gives an account of what happened. And this guy literally has arrows sticking out of his back when he gets to Fort Richardson, all right? And he gets there and he's brought to Sherman, and he gives an account of what happened. And he's also brought to this guy on the right, who's going to be an important character in our story. His name is Randall Slidell McKenzie. And McKenzie was the post commander of Fort Richardson at the time. And he's an 1862 graduate of West Point. He distinguished himself in combat during the Civil War. And McKenzie's the guy kind of in charge of this particular fort. And his immediate commander is sitting right next to him, William Tecumseh Sherman. And so Sherman's mad. He says, like, I almost got killed here. This guy barely survived. All these other guys did get killed. And so Sherman takes this very personally and decides that they're going to stamp this out. So Sherman gives direct orders to McKenzie here. And Sherman tells McKenzie, take your cavalry, 5,000 of them, and go marching out, riding out actually, go riding out and hunt down Santana, this Kiowa chief, and then hunt down his Kiowa band, and then hunt down anybody else you can possibly get, all right? And so my point in all this is that when you think back on those pressures that the Indians have been feeling, from population increase on this side and the killing of the bison on this side, and they're feeling this vice come around them, how do they react? Well, the Kiowas in this case attack. They're lashing out. But that doesn't solve the problem for them. What it does is it in fact gives the US Army a very direct reason to now attack the Kiowa, and then the Comanche and Apache and whoever else is left out on the plains. All right. And so that's really the story of what happens to the Kiowas and the Comanches and all the Plains Indians is they get attacked then by the U.S. Army in retaliation for the Indians striking back, essentially. And so Mackenzie, who, by the way, Mackenzie's a fascinating story all by himself, which I wish we had time to get into, but he leaves Fort Richardson with his cavalry. They come out here into the plains. They come out of the Panhandle. They capture Santana, bring him back in chains. He is then convicted of the Salt Creek Massacre and sentenced to death. And then Mackenzie will actually roam for 2 years, from 1872 to 1874. He and the cavalry up and down between the Rio Grande and the Canadian River up here in the Panhandle. He's going back and forth out here, just harassing and pushing back every Plains Indian group that he can get a hold of, basically, and really asserting U.S. Army dominance in the region. All right. And this is putting increased pressure on all these Plains Indians. So how do these Plains Indians react? They push back, right? They push back very directly. And one of the leaders of pushing back is another gentleman named White Eagle. This is a different White Eagle. This is a Comanche medicine man. So this is an image of him right here. So this is the actual guy. So here, this White Eagle, he's a Comanche medicine man. And as the Comanches are being pushed back and all these other groups are being pushed back, he stands up at this moment and says, hey, I've got a solution to all these problems, us being surrounded by the U.S. Army. And what he says is that he had this vision from the Great Spirit, and this is how he counted it. He rose up into the clouds. He was having a conversation with the Great Spirit, and the Great Spirit infused him with magical powers that he could use. He could raise the dead. He could control weather. And most importantly, he could use his magic to prevent the white man's bullets from piercing or killing any Comanche warriors, right? And, you know, if you were hearing that, you may or may not believe it, but White Eagle had somehow successfully predicted an eclipse of the moon, and he had predicted a drought. So he had a lot of cachet for having been right about a few things fairly recently. And so he rose up in power. He's also, and I just want to point this out, he's telling people what they want to hear. He's giving them a solution to a very complex problem. And that's a very appealing thing. And so he starts rising up in prominence amongst the Comanche because nobody else has a good solution for what's going on. And then this all comes to a head in May of 1874, because in May of 74, they're on the eve of summer, and the Comanches come together with a few other groups, including the Kiowa, and they have a ceremony called the Sundance, which I don't know if you know anything about the Sundance. It's actually a Kiowa tradition, was not a Comanche tradition, but the Comanche had adapted it. So it gives you a sense of how the Plains Indians kind of merging together at this point in support of each other. But they have this ceremony where it's in celebration of the sun. Indians from these different tribes would hang themselves from these tethers from their bodies. It's a very violent, sort of bloody kind of thing. But it was a very religious, spiritual ceremony, and it brought a lot of people together. Right, and that's what's important here. It brought a lot of people together on the plains. And White Eagle stands up at this ceremony, and he says, "Now is the time for us to act. Now is the time for us to push back against these white people who are destroying everything." And so he called for the extermination of the white people in the plains of Texas, especially the buffalo hunters who are destroying everything. So he stands up and says, not only we should do this, but I'm calling you to do this. I will protect you with my powers. And they rally up a whole bunch of warriors, about 600 to 700, who get organized and are now going to attack. All right. And so this group gets organized under White Eagle. You can see him over here on the right. It's sort of their spiritual leader. And their military leader is a guy you probably have heard of on the left, Quanah Parker, right, who is often called the last Comanche chief. He was not actually the last Comanche chief, but we'll put that aside for the moment. But he he was he's the son of Cynthia Ann Parker as well. That's a whole nother story in addition to this. But Kawana Parker is leading the military side of this pushback, and White Eagle is sort of the spiritual leader, and they're going to head out there. And they organized about 700 or so Plains Indians, mostly Comanches, but also Kiowas and Apaches and Kiowa Apaches. And their plan is to attack who? White people, but particularly buffalo hunters. Why? Because of this. So someone asked in the chat if we can get the image. I think it was Melissa. If we can get the image of this. And then the answer is yes. Every PowerPoint we use, we're going to post to Google Classroom. So you're going to get all these images and be able to use them in your own classroom if need be. But this image right here is what they are pushing against. And so the plan is to attack buffalo hunters. And so this leads to one of the most famous fights in Texas, Adobe Walls, in June of 1874. Which Adobe Walls, if you guys don't know, it's in the Panhandle. It's upper Panhandle, basically. But it was a buffalo hunter camp, is what it was, kind of on top of a mesa. And so, see this mesa right out here? It's basically on top of that was the buffalo hunter camp, essentially. And this was the kind of stopping off point when buffalo hunters would go out of the plains and they would kill a bunch of bison and they would bring them back, their hides back, and they would stack them up here waiting for wagons that would bring them back into the rest of Texas or towards Kansas where the railroad lines were. And so Kawana Parker and his men come out here knowing there's buffalo hunters, and they surround this buffalo hunter camp in the middle of the night in June of 74. And so on top of this mesa, imagine there's about 28 buffalo hunters. Oh, and one woman, but 28 buffalo hunters and one woman up on top of this mesa. And those guys are just resting, right? They're just kind of hanging out. It's the middle of the night. They're asleep. And Kawana Parker and his men think that they're going to have the element of surprise on their side, and that's what's going to help them win. But in history, things happen in weird ways. It was a windy night. And the plains wind, there's nothing to stop the wind on the plains. If anyone's from Lubbock or Amarillo, you know this, but like the winds just come through and they knock down the tent pole on the buffalo hunter's tent in the middle of the night. So these guys are up in the middle of the night trying to get their tent back up when they hear Kawana Parker's men outside of the camp coming toward them. So the element of surprise gets ruined from the very beginning. Otherwise, Kawana Parker and his men might have overrun them. But there's a fight that happens, and Kawana Parker and his men attack, but then get pushed back. And the problem is, who are they trying to attack? Buffalo hunters, who have very high-powered rifles and have the high ground. That is not an easy attack in any way, shape, or form. So for the next 4 days, there's a standoff where the buffalo hunters, all 28 of them, are firing at high velocity from high range and picking off various Indians in the distance. One of the best examples of this is Billy Dixon. Remember this guy? The guy who was the buffalo hunter? Well, he's at Adobe Walls. And according to him and a few other witnesses, he killed one of Kawana Parker's men with a rifle shot of over a mile. Just to give you a sense of the perimeter that they're maintaining here, which is really astounding. So the point being, there's really not a lot Kawana Parker and his men can do. They can't even get past a mile distance to get close to these guys to take them out, right? Word gets out what's going on. Other buffalo hunters converge to defend Billy Dixon and those other guys. So about 100 of them come in. Kawana Parker and his men have to back off. And basically it doesn't work out the way Kawana Parker and his men hoped it would. There's about 4 buffalo hunters that get killed. There's about 15 to 30 of Kawana Parker's men who get killed. So it's not hugely bloody necessarily, but it's a massive defeat for the Plains Indians because they've lost and now they must retreat. And the real danger here is that who's going to respond to this? Who responded to the Salt Creek Massacre? The U.S. Cavalry. Who's going to respond now? The U.S. Cavalry. In fact, it's going to be, once again, Randall Slidell Mackenzie. Now, I just want to point a little quick coda to this one. The person watching all this going on was White Eagle right here, right? Remember, he had promised that he could protect everybody and that his powers would make it impossible to lose, but he was wrong. and it became very obvious. And so in the aftermath of this, his status went really down south pretty fast. And so he got in a lot of trouble, and they renamed him from White Eagle to Issa Tai, which I do not speak Comanche, but I am told that Issa Tai means coyote anus. So he got a real bad nickname basically at the end of this whole thing and got pushed off to the side. But now the Comanches and the Apaches and the Kiowas have to deal with the aftermath. And that's the real story here, is that they anger the army comes out. And so Kawana Parker and his men go into the Llano Escotado, the plains region out here of West Texas and the Panhandle, right? Which we've been talking about in our classes since day one when you talk about geography. The phrase I always use in my classes is that geography matters, right? And it matters time and time again. And this is another great example of that. The aftermath of this is what's called the Red River War. So when Adobe Walls happens, the U.S. Army comes chasing the Plains Indians. And so for about a year, from June 1874 to June 1875, it's the Red River War, where the U.S. cavalry is coming after the Indians. But it's not really a war. I want to emphasize that. The Indians are running as fast as they possibly can, trying to get away. The U.S. Army organizes itself from 5 different directions and converges eventually on Palo Duro Canyon, which is where the last stand of the Plains Indians happens. So this is 5 different directions that the U.S. Army is coming from. They converge, as I said, in Palo Duro Canyon, the 2nd largest canyon in the entire United States. If you've never been there, it's absolutely gorgeous. But it's also the site of one of the most important endpoints in Texas history, because this is where Randall Slidell McKenzie right here, with his 5,000 troops, surrounds the Comanches and forces them essentially into the ground and surrender, all right? He captures almost all the Comanche horses, about 1,400 of them, kills all 1,400 of those horses, which for the Comanches was basically destroying everything they had in terms of being able to move and survive on the plains. And so that forced the final surrender that Kawana Parker makes in June of 1875, where he surrenders about 400 Comanches to the U.S. Army, who are then sent to Oklahoma and out of Texas. And when that happens in June of 75, I mean, it's an end of an age in Texas. Native power had been the most powerful thing in Texas from before the Spanish, through the Mexican period, through the Republic, really, and even into the 1850s, 1860s. Comanches in particular, but the Plains Indians had always been one of the most powerful influences there were. And now they've been defeated and they've been thrown out of Texas, essentially, in 1875. It's a new age in the state. Understanding how that process happened is really important, not only for its own sake, but also because it opens a new era in Texas history, this pivot. Because once these Plains Indians have been removed from the plains, what's out there? Open grassland territory. And it's only because of the removal of these Indians by the U.S. Army that we also then have the age of cattle that comes into the plains, and the cattle drives, and all of those pieces that fit together. So as we said at the very beginning, this is where we tie together these different pieces, that the railroad's expansion that helps lead to the destruction of the bison, that helps put pressure on the Indians, that helps lead to them getting pushed out by the U.S. Army, then opens up the plains for cattle to come into this territory and then hold up this whole new era in Texas history that we're going to talk about next week. All right. So I'm going to pause there again. And now I'm going to hand the mic over to my friend Jay, who's going to walk you guys through a few more resources.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Torget. I appreciate it. Working through this, I wanted to provide everyone with, I've been fortunate to work with Dr. Torget for years now. And one of the things that the feedback that I've gotten is, how do I use things and whatnot? So in classroom, here's Dr. Torget's presentation that you guys are commenting upon. And then if we scroll down to lesson plans day 2, I have a couple things in here. I have a hook exercise. I've got Indian Wars PowerPoint, but also have a primary source for Medicine Lodge treaty. The hook exercise is just a quick, easy way of introducing. For me, bringing this type of information into the classroom, it's going to be built around what Dr. Torget's talking about with that westward expansion piece that we all want to bring into it. And here are some primary sources from the great Right Father, which is the President of the United States, and Tin Bears, on the assurances that the United States government is going to ensure that the Comanches and other Native peoples maintain their lands. Well, obviously this was before we get to our time frame. And in addition to that, I also have, let me scroll down because I've got this above me. I have the Medicine Lodge treaty that gives students some background. Primary sources, there's 3 of them, and you hear Tin Bears talks about the past. This is really kind of a good perspective and insight for the students to understand how the land and the Native American culture is so valuable to these people, and how they view the white man coming in and disrupting all of this. So I've got a couple accounts. I've got all Santana's perspective of the Kiowa as well too. And then we have Tin Bear's perspective. Now, you could do this document itself. It would probably take my kiddos about a day to walk through this because I'd want to have more open conversations. But one of the things that I have noticed that we don't have a lot of time anymore is our classroom time. I incorporated that primary source document into the Texas Indian Wars, 1871-75, which really kind of follows Dr. Torget's presentation, trying to give it to a 7th grader to digest it as best possible. This could be a great opportunity to discuss westward expansion, tie these pieces together. And it really kind of follows through. But what I've done is I walk through this, I get some background of the 2 outspoken leaders, Tin Bears and White Bear, talking about here is the accounts from the primary sources, to rather than having the students write about it, you can do effective turn and talk activities. What do you think he's discussing? You can have them do a short little group writing workshop, but I brought the primary sources into the PowerPoint presentation. I found in my classroom, I like the primary sources, but I want to keep it together. But there's also days too, I kind of want to stop. All right, we're going to segue, let's go do this. Primary source. So I provided that opportunity to where you can incorporate it. It's already inside this PowerPoint presentation. And you can spend some good time having some really good, honest conversations about a Native American's perspective on this advancement by whites into it. And then I go through Salt Creek Massacre, spend some time on the Red River Wars itself, Adobe Walls, bring in Billy Dixon, his little quote that he talks about. And then also we'll end up with just coming down to the final pieces of it and final stand. And then I come into a few other quotes from different folks coming out. All my resources are inside the speaker notes. So if you're looking for where did that come from, they'll be presented in there. And then ultimately end up with my kids going back and analyzing the essential questions. And then I've also added on an extension to this, and I didn't put this in primary source format like we've done in the past. I just felt like this would be a good guided question to try to have the kids tie back Manifest Destiny into the range wars and whatnot. In addition to this, there's some other resources. I just discovered one resource here recently where the Tonkawa tribe in Central Texas were able to return to Texas and actually reclaim some of their lost lands. And then there's some other presentations in here, activities. You're going to see other little forms of gallery walks and things that we've done. If you've been with us before, you'll see some of the same stuff that we've done before. If this is your first time, this is some pretty cool stuff that you might want to spend some time just going through. And there's some other additional lessons as well too that build off of Chassidy's lessons as well too. So you have a wealth of information. One of the common questions comes out is, how do I use this in my classroom? That's the reason why I wanted to provide you with PowerPoint, or if you want to just do a standalone primary source analysis, you can definitely do that. So that's kind of what I wanted to bring to you guys today. I'm excited about next week, be able to tie in off of what Dr. Torget mentioned, and then we can move on to day 2. So I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Torget. Thank you all.
Right. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. So all that is available in Google Classroom. So you guys can grab as much as you can handle. We only have a couple quick minutes left. And I know that Kamiko's got some closing questions and such for you. I want to throw it open really fast though for any questions, thoughts, perspectives. I don't know if you guys got to see the web form that we've made. We'll get that for you guys for next week about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, activities. But I did want to ask a question from that sheet, and I'd like to hear y'all's perspectives on this. One of the things we put up there is on teaching considerations on teaching this. And the question is, what factors create constraints on teaching this content for you guys? And I'd be very curious to hear from you guys in the classroom what that might look like. And you can just unmute yourself and speak up. See, Lorenzo had his hand up, it looked like.
So one thing that I would say is for sure pacing time, but also navigating through ESL students. I know there's different terminology, EB, emergent bilinguals. So trying to make the information accessible to them as well. And I know that what's going to really help out for my population of students is the visuals. I think that's like one of the biggest things, and having them pair up with students that speak both English and their language. So I think that's going to be really good. But that's one of the things that I've had to like really adjust for, and that's my students that English is not their primary language.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think that visuals are great for everybody for that reason. They're so accessible, and everyone has an opinion about a picture. And so we have a lot of imagery sort of stuff. I thought Chassidy's work with the maps in particular, I think, is something that I would use in my classroom for that very reason. So as you said, the challenge for us is to make all of this as accessible for all of our students from all different backgrounds in all kinds of ways. And that's a challenge. And it gets to the thing I'm seeing in the chat, which is time. time as a constraint for everybody. And I totally get that. I'm going to call all of your districts and explain to them that you just need 6 more months for every topic, and then you'll double your pay as well. They'll listen to me, so don't worry, that'll happen. But yeah, I know that's the challenge that I think we all have with that, and I appreciate that. We only have a couple minutes left. Does anybody else want to share anything that would be a consideration of constraints that you're working with? Right. Well, then we answered everyone's question. Yes,
well, I would
please.
just share just another thing where it's been one of those things where I feel not really a constraint, but really engaging the students is making it personal to them, where I feel that if you can get the students to see just how real these impacts are, it means more to them. Because I know that there was a story recently in Austin, Texas, about some tribes getting some land back, and showing my students that they were really amazed. And since the beginning, we've talked about the impact of like the buffalo and the bison. So I know last year when we were looking at the picture of the mound of just skulls, like they were in shock. They're like, did you Photoshop this, sir? I was like, no, like that's a real photo. And I was like, that Photoshop didn't exist. This is the reality. And then they were upset because they're like, but sir, they used the buffalo for everything, because we had done analysis of what they would use the buffalo for. So I think once we really, make it real that this is real things that happened, I think it really captures them and keeps them, locked in. And I really love that that connection to the age of cattle, because I was like mind blown. I was like, I can't wait to use that connection and just really go deeper into that.
Well, thank you for that, Lorenzo. I couldn't agree with you more. Engagement is the key in teaching, if you ask me. And the more opportunities we can have students just have their minds blown by some amazing stuff that gets them excited. But to your point, that they see themselves somehow connected to this, that's what's really powerful.